So the book is framed around this concept, Candace MacLean's concept of dangerous memories, these fragments of liberation deliberately obscured by an oppressor. Was there a particular instance that first inspired you to draw that framework to your own life and the history in the 80s?
When I always thought I was gonna write the book, but not this book. I always thought I'd go back to this diary of when I was 18 and 19 and 20. And I thought there was a story there because it was a story of my time on the road in a punk rock band, and my wife and I in our early 20s starting a Catholic worker house, and I kept the stories of all the people who came through the house, the refugees, the guys coming out of prison. And when I started to read the book, I realized I had really no interest in wrestling with all my emotions of a young man. I was like, man, whatever. Let's get to the punchline. What happened? And in fact, I ripped out the first 4 pages of the diary in case anyone else came along and read it, because man, I was a wuss. But what struck me is that there were things in the diary about casual references to what was happening, and I realized that's how history is lived. We don't think we're living history, we're thinking we're living our lives. And so I began to look at these passing references to what was happening, and I realized that it had somehow been blotted from my memory. And the 1980s has this weird way of erasing the darkness and erasing just how scary that time was, but also making us forget the incredible acts of resistance. And so I came across that term dangerous memory, which is a theological term, and the light went on. I thought, that's what it is. The dangerous memories of history give us the seeds for resistance.
Of the, let's say, macro level observations, the links to the nuclear, anti-nuclear protests and the AIDS crisis, was there any that you found particularly removed from your memory that you really had to excavate and find, or that you were surprised that you had forgotten?
Well, the other night I was doing a reading and people said to me, but there's no place to go for marches anymore. There's no groups active. And one of the things that started when I started looking back, I remember the Lytton protests. I'm sure some people were here with the Lytton protests. You got arrested there. There you go, see? And my memory was like, yeah, we had mass marches. We had 35,000 people marching in Vancouver on Easter Sunday. We had 50,000 here. And I went back, and the first Lytton protest was on Good Friday, and it was a small group of church people standing outside the gates of the factory. And how much more meaningless and useless could you think of people standing there with their little crosses and signs on a Good Friday? And that was the morphing of a mass movement across Canada. Movements don't just happen. They start to build. And so I started to track the story of Lytton, the resistance, how they started to build networks, and then how Canada played a role in the national and international marches. And there's another story that I think is really important, and my wife always gives me, shines a light. She said, you didn't pay any attention to this back in the day because they were women, right? Greenham Common? I was like, yeah, I heard of Greenham Common, yeah, I knew about it. My wife said, no, you didn't know the story. How come you're so shocked now? I was like, well, I didn't pay attention, you're right. The story of Greenham Common. 4 young mothers were sitting around the table, terrified that if the bomb hit, and that's what people thought in 1983, the bomb was going to hit, they couldn't get to school to get their kids out, to get them to safety. And they didn't know what to do. So the 4 of them marched 120 miles to the Greenham Common military base. And they got laughed at the gates. And the guard said, you can stay here as long as you want. It won't make a difference. So the women stayed. The next year they had 30,000 women outside the gates. And then 70,000 women. 19 years of resistance. And Mikhail Gorbachev said at Reykjavik summit, when they were going to start to dismantle the nuclear threat, he said it was the women of Greenham Common that made him think peace was possible. That's how resistance is built. That to me is a story that needs to be shared today.
and throughout the book, there are references to one person, 5 people can make a difference, and it all starts locally, grassroots, on the ground. I mean, even you with Angela's house, and I guess looking to our present moment, where so many of these issues of concern are once again front and center: climate crisis, anti-democratic fascism. I guess, what do you think is missing? I guess so. I'm a millennial. I was born in the early '90s, so I feel like there's this prevailing sentiment among myself and people of my generation that it's so hard. How can one person make a difference? I guess, how can one change that mindset? What can we do to get back to this local grassroots activism?
That's a really important question. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book, talking to young Gen Z, who said to me, you don't know what it's like to live in a world with no future. And suddenly I was 18 again, because that in 1981, 1982, the world was going to end. In fact, if you read the book in 1983, it almost ended twice in 1 month. And people didn't know what to do. So that's why they marched. I've thought a lot about this, and I think that what we have to do at this time, there's like 4 steps. We have to rewire our brains. Because not only do we let Elon Musk and Bezos and Google wire our world, they wired how we see the world and how we understand it. So do you get those shame things like, Charlie, you're down 16% on your viewing time this screen. It's like, fuck yeah. So I've made it I've decided that every week, whatever Google in the cloud is going to be mad at me, I'm going to be down 36%. And that 36%, read. And if you don't read, garden. And if you don't garden, go for a walk or make model airplanes. I don't care what you do. Number 1, we have to rewire our brains, because our brains are in the toxic doom scrolling. You can't doom scroll. So that's number 1. Number 2, it's going to sound really lame, but you got to volunteer. Volunteer at your synagogue, your church, the Lions Club, volunteer someplace. Because what happened that we allowed to happen is the whole fabric of our society at the grassroots, we let it fall apart. And that's how the darkness came in. And we siloed ourselves, so we only hang with people we know. So volunteer, do something, go to the library. And you know what? The right wing, they're in all those places. So we got to take that back. So rewiring your brain, volunteer. Those are 2 really, really important things to do. I think number 3 is you have a responsibility to improve that little bit of the world around you, however you do it. Because we can't take on climate change. But if 3 more birds can live in your backyard, if monarch butterflies can survive, if you can do something about knitting together a better world, you're part of the solution. And number 4 is keep your eyes open. Because change will start happening in the craziest moments. And the conclusion, which I'm not going to read you because you have to buy the book, it's about hope in the face of dread, and the other element is luck. I know that doesn't sound like much to offer, but that's all we've ever had, and you don't get lucky unless you show up. So you got to be open, you got to be ready, and you got to go for it.
Early on in the book, you talk about Canadian Labour leader Bob White, who was part of the formation of the Canada Auto Workers Union. And it was a moment where Canadians broke free of American narratives and what American auto workers were doing. And I think being in a country like Canada, where culturally and trade-wise we are so reliant on the United States, it sometimes feels like we are forced to just fall in line. They elected Donald Trump a few weeks ago, and it feels like it's inevitable that federally we will be, as a country, electing Pierre Poilievre next year. So then, how do we resist that? How do we fight to change that, to not just accept it as an inevitability?
Well, there's a couple of ways to go in that answer. I write about in the early 80s the Canadian nationalism that existed. And it wasn't convoy nationalism. I don't know, I shudder every time I see a Canadian flag. I think it's a fascist carrying it. We gotta take back our symbols, right? They've stolen our symbols. We gotta take
Right?
Yeah. And in the early 1980s, there was the nationalism wasn't boorish. It was a belief that we could do something better. And I write, one of the first chapters in the book is called Operation Break the Working Class. And it's really important to know, again, that none of this was natural. This was constructed. The biggest economic crisis from the Depression was 1980, January 1980, and it was created. And it was created to break the American working class. And if you look at any of the economic charts from 1945 to 1980, this is what built the middle class, where people could afford homes. When a dad and a family on a single income could send their kids to university and they had a pension. That's all at 1980, and then from 1980, if you look at any of the economic graphs, it's downhill ever since. And so in 1980, they are going full on to break the union movement in the United States. There's millions of jobs being lost. It's a race to the bottom, and Canada is just getting hammered. And a little factory in Oshawa, Ontario, Hudai Industries, were being sold down the river, and the workers came in and occupied the plant. And nobody thought they had a chance. The Hudai occupation was fundamental for Canadian resistance, and it was Bob White, it was the auto workers along that 401 belt that resisted again and again Reaganomics. And so yeah, we got the crap beat out of us, but we didn't get nearly the crap that happened to the United States, because we had a tradition of resistance in the labor movement. And those are important lessons to learn, because Trump is coming for us full on. And we cannot bow and bend and be afraid. We can still resist and do it our way. And the story of the Hudai occupation, and I write about, our band was playing punk rock shows just down the road from the Hudai plant, and we didn't even know that history was being made. We gotta know our history, because we can't know our future unless we know our history. And so I try and capture some of those stories.
So the last question I'll ask, just kind of moving beyond, I mean, you've mentioned that you will not be standing in the next federal election after 20 years as an MP. I will say I was watching your interview, I believe it was CTV, and you mentioned that because your riding has been expanded geographically, it's been redistricted, and just the sentiment that you just physically feel less able to attend to all of the communities in the riding. I mean, it's sad, obviously, to see you go in Parliament, but what a sentiment that you want to give a certain level of care and you don't feel as able to, so you want to usher in someone who can. And so I appreciate that sentiment, and thank you for 20 years of serving the needs of the nation today on Parliament Hill. And so my last question to you, with that time back, what's next?
Wait and see. One of the reasons I also feel it's time to step out of Parliament is I've come to see a lot of things that didn't happen. Climate denialism is deeply embedded in the Canadian state. There's the overt deniers, but the overt deniers I don't have a problem with. They think the world is flat too, and they're going to burn the planet. It's the people who believe that we should be nice about burning the planet and say, well, if we plant a few more trees, we can still burn the planet because we don't want to upset the social and economic order. Canada is a corporate climate outlier, and I've realized in all my years of all the meetings, of all the hearings, that the power of the petrostate has us, and we have to take that back. So maybe it's about going to the streets. We have to start organizing, and because nobody's coming to save us. That's the lesson we learned from Trump. We thought, Kamala's going to come, and she's going to get a great VP, and they're going to get billions of dollars, and then, no, we got to build this from the grassroots. So I'm going to write, I'm going to play in the band, I'm going to cause as maximum amount of shit as I can. Because one thing I've learned, and I'm going to end on this, I believe as an elder, what screwed this for this generation happened on my watch. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. And so I've got a responsibility, because young people shouldn't have to despair. Young people should look to their elders, and their elders should say, we can do this. So that's my role, and that's our role, is to be there, to say to people, I don't know how we're going to get through this, but we're going to get through this. And to be there as allies, and as if it's in the vanguard, or if it's just making muffins and bringing support, that's our role. So that's going to be my role, is to be there to support the revolution. Thank you.
Well, I'll see you there. Thank you so much, Charlie.
Thank you.
Dangerous Memory, Coming of Age in the Decade of Greed, available now.